Hello, today we're going to be learning about absolutism in Western Europe. What is absolutism? Absolutism is a concept that was derived from the traditional assumption of power and the belief in the divine right of kings. Louis XIV of France was a good example of an absolute monarch. With Western absolutism, the power of a country was residing solely with the ruler. Absolute monarchs were not subordinate to the church, nor national assemblies, nor nobles. This is in contrast to the traditional Eastern European absolutism, where nobility remained powerful and they could prevent the absolute monarchs from having their way completely. Bureaucracies in the 17th century were composed of career officials appointed by and solely accountable to the king. They were often rising members of the bourgeoisie or the new nobility, aka nobles of the robe, who were able to purchase their titles from the monarchy. In doing so, the French and Spanish monarchies were able to effectively gain control of the Roman Catholic Church in their countries. They maintained large standing armies during peacetime, and monarchs no longer relied on mercenary or noble armies as they had in the 15th century and earlier. Additionally, rulers employed a secret police to weaken political opponents, and all these characteristics are what foreshadowed the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century. But what of the philosophy of absolutism? Jean Bodin was among the first to provide a theoretical basis for absolutist states. He lived and wrote during the chaos of the French civil wars of the 16th century and believed that only absolutism could provide order and force people to obey the government. Thomas Hobbes was another figure who believed in absolutism. He wrote The Leviathan in 1651 and articulated a pessimistic view of human beings. He believed that they were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short-strung. Additionally, he believed that anarchy results in chaos and that the central drive in every person is power. He stated that political sovereignty is derived from the people who transfer it to the monarchy by implicit contract, and his ideas justified absolute monarchy. Another important figure was Bishop Jacques Benin Bossu. He was the principal advocate of the divine right of kings in France during the reign of Louis XIV. Divine right meant that the king was placed on the throne by God and therefore owed his authority to no man or in no group. Next, we move on to the development of French absolutism. In the 17th century in France, the feudal tradition was that French society was divided into three estates. The first estate was the clergy, which is 1% of the population. The second estate was the nobility, which is 3 to 4% of the population. And the third estate was the bourgeoisie, aka middle class, which was made up of artisans, urban workers, and lastly there was peasants. This hierarchy of social orders was based on rank and privilege, was restored under the reign of Henry IV. France was primarily agrarian. 90% of the population lived in the countryside, and its population of 17 million made France the largest country in Europe. This accounted for France becoming the strongest nation in Europe in the future. Under Henry IV, he led the foundations of France becoming the strongest nation in Europe in the 17th century. He strengthened the social hierarchy by strengthening the government institutions, aka parliaments, the treasury, universities, and the Catholic Church. He was the first king in France to actively encourage French colonization in the New World, which stimulated the Atlantic trade. He was also the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. He came to power in 1589 as a part of a political compromise to end the French Civil Wars. He converted Calvinism to Catholicism in order to gain recognition from Paris for his reign. He issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, providing a degree of religious toleration for Huguenots, which were Calvinists. Additionally, he weakened the nobility. The old nobility of the sword, people who were born into the nobility, were not allowed to influence the royal council. Nobles of the robe, people who purchased their titles from the monarchy, were able to become officials in government and remain loyal to the king. They had been commercially successful members of the bourgeoisie and now sought to raise their social status. An important figure was the Duke of Sully, who made reforms that enhanced the power of the monarchy. He increased the role of the state in the economy in order to achieve favorable balance of trade with other countries. He granted monopolies in production of gunpowder and salt, and encouraged manufacturing of silk tapestries, and monopolized mining. Additionally, he reduced the royal debt and employed systematic bookkeeping and budgets. Uh, in contrast, Spain was drowning in debt. Additionally, he made tax reforms that made it more efficient and equitable. Additionally, oversaw improved transportation and began a nationwide highway system. Henry IV was assassinated in 1610 by a fanatical monk who sought revenge for Henry's granting of religious protections from the Huguenots. This led to a severe crisis in power, and his widow, Mary de' Medici, ruled as a regent until her son Louis XIII came of age. Now we move on to Louis XIII. In his youth, his regency was beset by corruption and mismanagement. Feudal nobles and princes were able to increase their power, and some nobles convinced him to assume power and exile his mother. Cardinal Richelieu laid the foundations for the Absolutism in France. Like Henry IV, he was a politique, which means he placed political issues ahead of religious principles. He created the intendant system, which was used to weaken the nobility. It replaced local officials with servants, aka intendants, who reported directly to the king. Intendants were largely middle class or minor nobles of the robe, and each of the country's 32 districts had intendant responsible for justice, police, and finance. Thus, the government became more efficient and centrally controlled. He built upon Sully's economic achievements in further developing mercantilism. He increased taxation to fund the military, although his tax policies were not as successful as Sully's. He resorted to the old system of selling offices, and tax farmers ruthlessly exploited the peasantry. Richelieu subdued the Huguenots. With the Peace of Versailles, Huguenots lost their fortified cities and Protestant armies. Calvinistic aristocratic influence was thus reduced. Lastly, there was the 30 Years' War. Richelieu and Louis XIII sought to weaken the Habsburg Empire, a traditional French policy dating back to Francis I and early mid-16th century. In doing so, they reversed the Maria de' Medici's pro-Spanish policy and declared war against Spain in 1635. France supported Gustavus Adolphus with money during the Swedish phase of the war. Later, France entered the international phase of the war and ultimately forced the Treaty of Westphalia on the Habsburgs. Louis XIV is the quintessence of an absolute ruler in European history. He personified the idea that sovereignty of the state resides in the ruler, his famous phrase being, "L'état c'est moi." He became known, or nicknamed, as the Sun King, since he was the center of French power, and this is similar to how the sun is the center of our solar system. He strongly believed in the divine right of kings, a theory advocated by Bishop Bousseau, and he had the longest reign in European history, 72 years. He inherited the throne when he was 5 years old, from his father Louis XIII, Henry IV being his grandfather. France became an undisputed major power in Europe during his reign through his modernized, state-controlled military. A big part of this was due to France's large population, meaning a massive standing army could be created and maintained. French culture ended up dominating Europe, and French became the international language for over 2 centuries. Moving on, he was humiliated by nobles in a French civil war called the Fronde. This scarred him, and he never forgot about the humiliation he faced at the hands of the nobles early on, and was determined to control the nobility in the future. In order to begin to control the nobles, Louis recruited his chief ministers from the middle class in order to keep the aristocracy out of the government. He continued the intendant system begun by Richelieu, and he checked the power of the French institutions that might resist his control. The parliaments were fearful of resisting him after the failure of the Fronde, and officials who criticized the government could be arrested. He never called the Estates General into a session. Additionally, he also attempted to control the peasantry with something called the corvée, which was forced labor that required peasants to work for a month out of the year on roads and other public projects. Idle peasants could be conscripted into the army or forced into workhouses. Rebellious peasants could be executed or used as galley slaves on ships. With all the money saved by forced labor and the money that was coming in from tax policies, Louis XIV was able to fund the building of the Versailles Palace, which was the most impressive palace in Europe, and it was a great reinforcement of his image as the most powerful absolute ruler in Europe. In doing so, he was able to gain control over the nobility and, in a sense, capture them and imprison them with entertainment. Moving on, we have religious policies. The Edict of Fontainebleau was the direct opposite of the Edict of Nantes. In fact, it revoked the Edict of Nantes, and Huguenots lost their right to practice Calvinism. And as a result, about 200,000 Huguenots fled France for England, Holland, and the English colonies in North America. Huguenots later gave major support of the Enlightenment and its ideas of religious toleration. Louis supported the Jesuits in cracking down on Jansenists, Catholics who held some Calvinist ideas. Speaking of his wars, here's a takeaway that you need to know, is that they were initially successful, but they eventually became economically ruinous to France. Due to all of his wars, a balance of power system emerged in response to the threat posed by Louis XIV. No one country could be allowed to dominate the continent since a coalition of the other countries would rally against a threatening power. His first war was the War of Devolution, which is the First Dutch War. Louis XIV invaded the Spanish Netherlands, aka Belgium, without declaring war. The result was the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Louis received 12 fortified towns on the border of the Spanish Netherlands, but gave up the French Comté, aka Burgundy, to Spain. Next was the Dutch War. Louis invaded the southern Netherlands as revenge for the Dutch opposition in the previous war. The Dutch flooded the countryside by opening their dikes, preventing France and England from invading Holland. The result was the Peace of Nijmegen. It represented the furthest limit of the expansion of Louis XIV. Additionally, France took the French Comté from Spain and gained some Flemish towns and took Alsace. Next is the 9 Years' War, War of the League of Augsburg. Louis launched another invasion on the Spanish Netherlands in 1683, and in response, the League of Augsburg, formed in 1686 by the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Sweden, Bavaria, Saxony, and the Dutch Republic, were the opposition in this war. This additionally resulted in the military rivalry between England and France that lasted until Napoleon's defeat in 1815. The war ended with status quo prior to the war, and French remained in control of Alsace and the city of Strasbourg in Lorraine. The next war was the War of Spanish Succession, which was caused by Charles II giving up Spanish territories to the grandson of Louis XIV. The result was the Treaty of Utrecht, which was the most important treaty between the Treaty of Westphalia and the Treaty of Paris. It maintained the balance of power in Europe, and it ended the expansionism of Louis XIV. The cost of Louis XIV's war is that they destroyed the French economy due to a severe disruption of trade. 20% of the French subjects died, and a huge debt would be placed on the shoulders of the Third Estate. The French government was essentially bankrupt. These financial and social tensions sowed the seeds of the French Revolution later in the century. In part due to the wars, resulted the decline of the Spanish Empire in the 17th century. Another part of its decline was the Spanish Inquisition, which was created by Ferdinand and Isabella in the process of centralizing power. The discrimination and persecution of Jews and Moors caused most of those respective populations to immigrate from Spain and that caused the total population to go from 7.5 million to 5.5 million within about 100 years. Additionally, its trade fell with its colonies about 60% between 1610 and 1660. This was largely due to the Dutch and English competition. Additionally, its treasury went bankrupt at various times between 1594 and 1680. Additionally, poor work ethic stunted economic growth. Upper class eschewed work and continued a life of luxury, and many noble titles were purchased which provided tax exemptions for the wealthy. Capitalism was far less prevalent than it was in the Netherlands and England. Additionally, it saw a political and military decline. Symbolically, England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was seen by historians as the beginning of the decline of the Spanish Empire. However, Spain had the most formidable military until the mid-17th century. Poor leadership by Philip II, Philip IV, and Charles II also escalated the decline. In 1640, Portugal reestablished its independence, and a result was the Treaty of Pyrenees, which marked the end of Spain as a great power. Additionally, the War of Spanish Succession saw Spain lose most of its European possessions at Utrecht. One final concept is a connection between the Baroque and Absolutism. It was an art style that reflected Absolutism, and it also sought to overwhelm the viewer. The Versailles Palace is a good example of Baroque architecture and sculpture. Baroque painting had some important figures like Peter Paul Rubens and Diego Velázquez. Baroque music also had some important figures like J. S. Bach and George Frederick Handel. And with that final idea, that wraps up our lesson on Absolutism in Western Europe.